Hello, my name is Virgil. I want to talk about Invasion of the Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. I also want to talk about other stories, sort of body snatching theme. There's another book that's lesser known, better written, more terrifying. In that book, and I apologize, the lighting situation was giving me some trouble, so this is what we end up with. Now, I think we all kind of know Invasion of the Body Snatchers from movies. Made in movies maybe 4 times. The book has some key differences, how it chooses to tell that story and how movies do. We need to sort of make sure that we're on the same page about what I mean when I say body snatching. That might seem kind of obvious, but there's a lot of similar concepts that aren't quite the same. First is, I'm not talking about Victorian era sort of body snatching where someone like robs a grave and it's for like some sort of like Frankenstein's monster type experiment or for medical students to practice on. Secondly, I'm not talking about body swapping. That would be in a case where the consciousness of one entity would swap with another. They made all kinds of movies about stuff like that, and then you also get some weird alien type horror stuff. In fact, one of Lovecraft's great stories, The Shadow of Time, is specifically, spoiler I guess, dealing with body swapping. A really great early scene of the book where the main character wakes up and it's been like 10 or 12 years. He doesn't really remember any of that time. What he does know is that I don't think he works at his job anymore. Like, he's been fired for a long time. None of his family will talk to him except for maybe his youngest son, and that's it. Like, his wife has divorced him and left him and won't speak to him, and neither will his daughter. That's an example of body swapping. That's a really great Lovecraft story also. But in body swapping stories, you really don't have the memories of that other person usually, and you might even have difficulty with basic function like walking or knowing how or what to eat. The swapped person has no access to those thoughts, those memories, those ideas, and just sort of sometimes just absolute basic life functions. Third, we're not talking about a mimic or a doppelganger. Someone who looks just like you and sort of wants to take your place. They'll be able to pass themselves off somewhat convincingly as you, but maybe not completely convincingly. Key difference there is that you as an entity still exist outside of the doppelganger. So you're the imposter is usually a doppelganger type tactic, right? I'm the real one and you're fake. The difference being, though, between body snatching or body snatchers and doppelgangers is that you still exist while that copy exists, and you can meet and interact. Usually those interactions are bad. Lastly, we need to make a distinction between body snatching and possession or thraldom or something like that. Usually that's the concept that you would find in horror or fantasy. A really classic one, or 2 really classic ones I guess, would be a vampire's thrall. You get bit by a master vampire and now you're kind of mentally enslaved to that vampire and you act evil and do evil things, but you still have all the memories and thoughts and emotions maybe even that you had as a person, but your motivation and your direction and how you act is completely different. The same would go for possession. Those are super close to body snatching, but there's I guess a slight difference, and I don't know if I'm splitting hairs here, in part because I don't want to sort of draw all that stuff in, all those traditional myths about vampires and ghosts and all that kind of stuff. It's that evil part that's different. In a body snatching situation, it's just sort of an alien wants and desires, alien intelligence. The motivation for something that's evil is generally opposite of what you want. So whatever it is that you want, right? Whatever is good, you want to be happy and live a comfortable life. Whatever this evil thing is, it wants the opposite of that, almost always. It always wants to undo that stuff, to destroy those things, and it wants the opposite for itself for whatever reason. It's just sort of its motivation. And alien intelligence, for example, these sort of alien entities that we get in Lovecraftian stories, don't really want those evil things. What they want, we don't really understand. That's what's kind of scary about this. We can kind of understand this evil thing wants the opposite of what we want. It values you because it wants to corrupt your soul, you're a valuable thing. But an alien intelligence doesn't think you're valuable at all. Not even a sentient thing to it. You can't really reason with it. It doesn't really have anything to say to you. That's the difference. That's what body snatching is. Body snatching is some sort of entity taking over whose wants and needs are just kind of hard to understand or almost impossible. You just don't get it. You can't quite puzzle them out. It's too different from you, and it has access to your capacities, your memories, and your body. And depending on what sort of variety of body snatcher it is, it doesn't care about what you want or don't want. It just looks at you like a thing to be used up. An end to a means to an end to a means. A pretty important thing to understand. Those are really, really close. Really, really close. Like, they look super close. It's just that the motivations are different. And I think that really ends up giving a different tone to those stories. So let's talk about Jack Finney's The Body Snatchers, or Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Originally serialized in 1954 in Colors magazine and then later published in 1955 as its own book, the story follows a young doctor in the small town of Mill Valley. He is visited by an old friend, kind of a mutual friend of theirs, who is really kind of having like this, like almost like a mental break. And she's wondering if he could kind of come over and talk to her. And in talking to her, she says that her father is not her father. There's a conversation that happens where he kind of says, well, I mean, why do you think that, And she kind of tries to explain it to him, and he's kind of like, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you go see this psychiatrist friend of mine? So this sort of weird thing happens, and then all these like cases start popping up. Slowly these people keep showing up at his office, and they keep saying the same sort of thing. This person is not this person. And I get what they're trying to do. Finney's trying to like harp on that concept. A little heavy-handed because they all say the same thing. It's all like this, seeming like this huge leap to say like, this is not this person. But the whole story has kind of like a sensationalized sort of mood to it, and there's some good stuff in here. It's totally breaking my script right now. I definitely think that it like really harps hard on that like sensational, like, ooh, like thriller. It's almost like, oh my God, it's Godzilla. That's kind of what this book goes for. And there's some sections that are really good. But sometimes, especially when it gets to like the medical stuff, it doesn't seem like a very good doctor to me. But anyway, so these people keep showing up saying these things. They keep saying, hey, so-and-so is not so-and-so. Okay, we keep sending them to the psychiatrist friend. The guy's like, I don't know. Until finally, a writer who lives in the Mill Valley asks him to come over to his house. And he says, I don't want to tell you why, but it's really important. This writer and his wife show him a body tucked away in their house. It has like very smoothed over features. It kind of looks half finished. The doctor's kind of like asking like, why didn't you call the police? And they're kind of like, oh, a couple weird things happen here. Okay. For one, they decide to fingerprint the body. Narratively, it makes sense because they're trying to establish this early and in a quick manner that this is not human, that there's something weird going on. A little bit of a leap to like, let's fingerprint this body, and oh my gosh, it doesn't have fingerprints. And then the doctor's like, you guys stay here. I'm going to go home. Tells the writer, like, you get some rest, and tells his wife, you keep checking on this thing and tell me if anything changes. Not long after that, later that night, I think they show up at his house. And the writer's like, my wife went down there. She saw something, and she won't tell me what it is. She wouldn't let me look at it. We had to leave right away. And so I have no idea what's going on. And the doctor's like, okay, all right, you guys stay here. I'm going to go take a look. I won't give away much more than that. I think that's pretty much the lead in for the story. If you've never seen the movies, this is a light, this is a spoiler, but I just have to have a hard time thinking that you haven't seen any body snatching type fiction of any kind. But I do want to kind of talk about some of the details. Instead of talking about it right here, which is where I really want to do it, there is going to be like a spoiler section at the end of the video. Just save that for there. But what I do want to say about the book is that it does a really good job of sort of building this level of suspense. It really does kind of get you, especially in like, I would say maybe the first half or 2/3 of the book, even gets to be pretty late. Even when like, I think some of the narrative ideas kind of start to break down a little bit. Even then, it does a good job keeping it suspenseful. Some of the science fiction stuff, it just doesn't work very well. Kind of reading, I thought, well, that's a weird way to end it. Then I read something, somebody said, oh, this is kind of weird, isn't it? And I'm like, oh yeah, that is kind of stupid. Well, okay, I didn't think about it at the time, but yeah. So there's I'll talk about that later. This is so vague. It's a much better story if you approach it from a point of view of like a horror or thriller book. It uses sci-fi trappings, but it isn't like very familiar with them, at least, or it seems very loosely associated with them. The way that the scenes build and the way that the reveals happen and everything are well done. Definitely a great sense of dread. There's a point in the story where they leave Mill Valley and then they go back. The town is described as like this sort of like dead, like thing that's kind of like watching them. They definitely feel like they don't belong. But they come back in that town, and there's just this feeling of everything kind of like a corpse that they're coming back into, and this corpse is sort of like watching them. A lot of really good mood setup. There's a whole lot of like side stuff going on. The most notable one is that the doctor meets up with a friend, and I think she is also divorced. They have an interest in each other, and they're kind of like pseudo start dating. They're kind of like going out, but they're not really dating, and he doesn't really want to date her, but he does like spending time with her. It's not that I have a problem with like a budding romance, but there's just the amount of times that the doctor like says like, I don't really want to be in a relationship with her, but we're going to do this, and it just like breaks up some of the tension, I guess. But I don't think it was really to the book's benefit a lot of times. Like, okay, you don't want to date her right now. The end. Keep going. After they come back to Middle Valley, overhearing this conversation between these pod people mockingly talking. And I don't remember if they're mocking the speech patterns of the doctor himself or something like that, but it's something along those lines. And he tells this anecdotal story to sort of describe how he felt. If it had been a lot shorter, probably would like kind of say, it was a kind of a weird thing. He used to get his shoes shined by this guy. Always like say, oh, what great, how you doing, Captain? He'd have like a little nickname for everybody. Oh, how's it going, Sergeant? You know, what's going on there, Corporal? Comment on their shoes, and oh, really good shoes here. The doctor says that driven to another part of town or something and slid down in his car and sleeping, and he heard these two people meet up and start talking and having an exchange, and he realized that one of these guys was that shoe shine guy. He started using those same like Captain, Sergeant type stuff and like in a very mocking tone, and then the other guy he meets is like, oh man, that's cool. And the doctor's like, well, I never got my shoes shine again. In fact, I avoided that street. And that's how it felt to hear them talk about us, these pod people. Definitely like a hairy dog story. A really long-winded way to go to say, yeah, they were talking about us and I didn't like it and I saw through. Right away you see maybe something's going on and I'm withholding a piece of information, which is the fact that the shoe shine guy was black. Didn't feel like we needed to spend all this time doing it. And also, you have to always be chipper and like maybe you're having a bad day or whatever. And so you're like, oh, you know, just kind of mocking, not even mocking the people that he shines shoes for, but just mocking himself and expressing the idea that like it's hard to kind of always be chipper. And the doctor's response to that is like to cancel him. You might think a doctor might have some compassion, maybe, I don't know. I think Finney said more about himself there than he said about anything else. For so much time and writing given to it, it doesn't seem reasonable that I would ignore it. That's a bit on Invasion of the Body Snatchers. A good story, worth your time. That it isn't like a super, like, I'm not trying to suggest that the book is super racist, because I don't think that it is, but I don't love that part of the story. And there's some parts of it I don't like with a girlfriend, long-winded, like just freaking either say, I'm not going to date you, or like, you know, I like you, but I don't know what I want to do right now. Now, the body snatching stuff is pretty good until stuff starts to get explained, and then it just all, but moving on. I recalled a story I had read a long time ago. Rodger Dee is the writer, and the name of the story is Unwelcome, Tenant. It's available for free. I'll put a link in the description. Dee wrote this story, this astronaut who's flying to a single-man mission to Mars. I should mention that the story was published in 1950, and that's an interesting date, and we'll talk about why that is in a little while. As he's flying towards Mars, he begins to leave the pull of Earth's gravity. And as he does, he has like this overwhelming fear sort of take over him, and he doesn't know what happened. And all of a sudden he sort of feels the fear recede, and he's kind of like scratching his head, like kind of like what just happened to me? What was that all about? Then he starts to realize that there's all these things, these sort of like scientific principles and concepts that were sort of difficult or obtuse to him for a long time, that he suddenly like sees are very simple and easy, and he starts like figuring things out very, very quickly. I think he does the like the landing calculation, what he needs to do for his approach, something that would normally take him hours. He does in like 10 minutes. I'm wondering why this is, and then he realizes that his entire life he's had some sort of like a mind parasite repressing his thoughts and repressing his capabilities. It was sort of tied to the gravity of Earth. Everyone else on Earth is also infected with this and also repressed. He's like, I'm going to try and get everybody off Earth and get them to Mars where everyone will be safe. And then he enters Martian gravity. Really great, very short story. It's for free. Kind of a cool story. Rodger Dee wrote a lot of science fiction, mostly in the 50s. I don't know if I've read any other Rodger Dee stories. I might have, because I've read a lot of science fiction of that era, like when I was younger. Iron Empires by Chris Moeller. Now, I really like his art style, really dynamic art style. I believe he does all the writing for that story as well. The Valen, there's sort of a mind worm or something that can be surgically implanted at the top of the spine, and they'll take over. The story follows this warrior priest who comes to this planet and realizes that these Valen are going to invade the planet and try and take over. A hard-nosed, abrupt, and sort of brutal sort of character. Really a fun character to read about, though. He tries to stop this invasion, and it makes for really great reading. There's 2 parts, both out of print. I read the first. I've not read the second. I've got to get it. There was also a tabletop RPG. It's a Burning Wheel sort of offshoot called Burning Empires. Burning Wheel is a particular like role-playing system. Like focuses heavily on role-playing and is also like kind of mechanically complex. And Burning Empires, the RPG, is kind of a unique tabletop RPG in a way too. Like it's a very structured RPG. It's almost board game-ish. It's a neat system. I've never gotten a chance to play it. You need a pretty dedicated group of adults to really go after that and really be invested in it and be invested in the comic to know the world and everything. But maybe worth your time. Maybe it's fodder for some sort of inspiration of some other variety. I had a copy of Burning Empires at one time and somehow like let go of it or whatever, and I repurchased it. For the most part, when I looked, they're a bit high, so hunt for that for a little while. So now we come to the moment of truth. I wanted to talk about this book for a long time. I read it the first time about 6 years ago, and I kind of immediately was like, wow, I'm surprised that this kind of big name writer sort of like so completely just sort of wholesale took this idea. And then I compared copyright dates and realized that this book came 3 years earlier. And I would say that it is superior to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and I would also say that it is considerably more terrifying. Robert Heinlein's Puppet Masters. Now, maybe you've read this book before. It's possible. It's possible. Robert Heinlein's a pretty big name, and it's not exactly hard to find this story. And maybe you might say, you're crazy. That book's not scary. And I'd say, okay, you're right. It isn't. It does not try to do the same things that Invasion of the Body Snatchers does. Body Snatchers is kind of like a thriller or a horror story. And this is not. This is definitely a science fiction story. There's a matter-of-factness to the sort of narration that's sort of characteristic of Heinlein in general. Well, it may not be this sort of like really intense suspense or really play up on like horror language that Invasion of the Body Snatchers uses. This book is absolutely nightmare fuel. On reflection, if you just breeze through the book and read it and you don't think about it, that was kind of cool. Yeah, those creatures were kind of nasty. Let's talk about the book for a second. It was originally serialized in 1951, 1 year after that Rodger Dee story. I don't really think that this story comes from the Rodger Dee story or anything, but I just thought it was kind of neat that sort of idea of these things kind of controlling you was there just a little bit earlier. Actually, if that was published in 50, there's a good chance these are written almost at the same time, because short story would have come out a little earlier, a little easier than a novel. There was some text omitted from the 1951 version. Mostly it was stuff that was considered a little too risque for the time. Probably whatever version of the book that you're going to read nowadays is going to be the added text. The text was those removed parts, those edited down parts were added back in, I think, shortly after Heinlein's death. I will say that there is a scene in there in this book that I think that was edited out. It doesn't really like change anything. It's like a color scene, I guess you'd call it. But I think it really characterizes just how terrifying the Puppet Masters are. Puppet Masters is set kind of in the future. There's sort of like flying cars and space travel. Maybe not too much more advanced than our time. In fact, some of their technology is even behind ours. It follows Sam, the agent in like this kind of government, this sort of like semi-secret or secret government organization. Sam is put on a mission with the old man who's sort of the director of their organization, and Mary, and those are all kind of code names. A mysterious object landed in a remote area of Iowa, and other agents have gone in to look at it, but have never come back. The local news stations reported a story about, oh, this is like something crazy is going on, and then came back and said, oh, it's just a hoax, just some kids painted up cardboard and like steel thing. It's nothing, it's just a hoax. So Sam, the old man, and Mary go in to investigate this flying saucer that these kids made. They decide not to go into the saucer because they seem a little too eager to get them into it. And instead they kind of back away, and then they talk about how like it's just a hoax and these kids were supposed to just sort of piece it together, but like all the stuff that was used to make that, it looks like it's brand new. Like it would have been very expensive to build this thing, and that property that they're on, this farm that it's supposed to have been, these kids are supposed to live on and have made it, is like dirt poor. Seems very out of place. Later they go to a local news station, and there they're attacked, and Sam is able to kill the attacker, and they discover he has this gray slug-like thing on his back. The book seems to have been like well received. It's kind of hard for me to tell. Some pretty decent praise about the book. In fact, there was some pretty good response. There's a scene or two in the book that it's not bad. I think it's in the Senate, and like they're trying to find out if senators are infected, and so people were like held at gunpoint and made to strip to see if they have slugs on them. That's an intense scene, especially considering that like you're talking about like the U.S. Senate. Let's see if you're really a citizen or not is kind of like one of those like concepts that kind of floats around your head. It makes a lot of sense in the context of the book, and I don't know that it's exactly supposed to mean anything that way. Like trying to weed out the traitors, so to speak. There is a movie called The Puppet Masters, a film version of the book. I don't know anything about it. You have to watch it at your own risk. I don't know how faithful it is or even if it's any good. There was a Roger Corman produced movie that sort of ripped off this book, and they got sued, and Heinlein won. They had to never refer to him or his work. The name of that Corman movie is not written here. Something I had forgotten that is true. There are multiple instances in Star Trek of very, very, very similar encounters with aliens that are derived in some parts from the Puppet Masters. The last episode or two of the first season of the Next Generation of Star Trek. So Star Trek Next Generation, first season, last episode, I believe, and maybe the second season, first episode, or it's the last two episodes of the first season. I just can't remember. Those are almost direct, I wouldn't say rip-off, but they are certainly highly inspired and derived from the Puppet Masters in a lot of ways. And even the concept of the Borg themselves is very body-snatching type thing, because the Borg sort of like utilize, especially like John Luke, and when they capture him, they want him because he's such a competent captain and a competent person in general that he's a very useful tool for them to own. And in that same sense, the Puppet Masters, the slugs, like Sam, when they get a hold of him at one point. Sorry, a slight spoiler there. I think that was something was going to happen. This book is 3 years before Body Snatchers. So Body Snatchers is borrowing from this book, not the other way around, which is what I thought at first, where Body Snatchers tries to go for that scary sort of thriller, like fear thing. Like it actually tries to go for that, and then sometimes kind of gets it. This book doesn't. It doesn't try to go for that. It's just that the events and the things that happens and the way the slugs work are just completely horrifying and terrible. Relayed in this sort of, oh, and this happened. We follow Sam the whole time. He narrates the book. That's who our narrator is. You're just thinking about like, Jesus. It's usually what I'm saying. I'm like, this is horrible. This is a horrible world. I don't want to be there. Something else, too, is that Body Snatchers is a book about invasion, right? The Puppet Masters is actually not just an invasion. It's an invasion and occupation story. It kind of says, like, well, what would have happened if we didn't just immediately crush this sort of invasion, if it kind of got away from us? It takes a lot of those ideas and a lot of the capabilities of an alien entity that could do those things, that could snatch bodies, to, like, its logical conclusion. And a lot of times those logical conclusions are not very comfortable. I'm starting to run into the wall, and I kind of want to say something, and I'm like, yeah, I'm getting into, like, spoiler stuff, so this is what I'm going to say. Okay, I'm going to have to spoil something. I'll have to spoil a little bit in Body Snatchers, too. Yeah, I'm going to kind of guess that you maybe already are somewhat familiar with how Body Snatchers work, so I'm not going to actually tell you like specifically what happens and when happens. I'm just going to sort of like say, and this is how body snatchers work and pod people and all that other stuff. And this is also an excellent time for me to say you can like and subscribe if you're enjoying what's going on here. I appreciate it. There that is. Here's the timestamp you can skip to if you don't want to be spoiled. Thank you again. Away we go. And the spoilers begin pell-mell. For the body snatchers, the way the pod people work is like this. A pod is placed close to you when you sleep, and the electrical patterns of your brain when they're at their calmest, when you sleep, are transferred to the pod, and the pod sort of like downloads your consciousness, models itself on you, and grows into an exact duplicate of you. And your original body, the original you, turns into a gray fluff. And now you're a pod person. The pod person has all the memories and thoughts, but none of the emotion. Like pod person agenda is also like on top of everything. Another interesting thing about pod people is they only live for 5 years. Their plan for the planet was to like take over everything, and then everything dies in 5 years, and then just move on. And I was talking earlier about like some of the science. It was a little soft. The idea was that the pods sort of like float through space, pushed by light, because light pushes on everything. And yeah, that was like a misunderstanding on Finney's part as to how that works, because the reference that he was going for was like these microscopic particles. And also at the end of the book, like the pods are kind of like, oh man, this place sucks. We're out of here. And they just like lift up and float away. It's like, well, how do they float away? I don't know. It doesn't matter. And that's why I say it's really a much better horror or suspense or thriller novel than it is a science fiction novel. Because if you look at the science, like transferring your brain, it picks up, and it seems a little like, okay, like when you're asleep, that's when it's the best time. Okay, it seems like you could just tie somebody up too. I mean, it seems like, is it really that hard? I don't know. The way that the puppet masters work is there's a slug. Generally, it needs to get to your spine. You are still you, but you're like totally willing to do whatever it wants. In fact, you don't even really necessarily have a sense of it being there. You just sort of like do things sort of, I wouldn't say exactly mindlessly, but without much thought. Use your fullest capacity to do them, or you do them effectively and completely. You just don't really think about anything while you're doing it. You don't really think about anything else. Interesting that like as a pod person, you can't come back. Like once you become a pod person, you're done. Destroys the original copy. Your thoughts and memories are in this pod copy, but you have this like pod person sort of like co-piloting with you. Puppet masters, it's like it's still you. And you can still act like you and think like you, but you'll follow any directions that the slug will give you. Sometimes called the master or the puppet master, depending on the word in the book. I like the term slug. If a slug just touches you, if it just touches you anywhere, it kind of like paralyzes you. You can't move, and then it can just sort of like crawl up your spine. Essentially, the best access to you and controlling you from the top of your spine usually is like a lump high up on your back. They can still sort of like direct you from an extremity to some extent. It's just a lot slower response or not very good control. This is really good scene. Showcases how puppet masters work. Sam is in a struggle with this hag-ridden, is something they sometimes say. He's in a struggle with this hag-ridden person. And he gets hit, and he goes black, and he blacks out, and he wakes up. He hears these guys talking and everything, and they're like, oh, they're carrying somebody off. And then it describes him running down the hallway and getting some clothes, because they all had to strip to see who had slugs on them. He goes out this sort of secret exit that they have, and he goes to the store, and he finds a random guy, and he punches it and takes his wallet. And you're thinking, what has he got going on right now? What is he doing? And then he goes to this apartment, and he rents an apartment, and he makes a phone call to Iowa, and you're like, oh my God. But it's like, it goes on for it goes on for a paragraph or two, and you're just kind of like it's just like this sense of like, did I miss something? What's going on right now? But it like takes a second, because there's no language or anything that signals that Sam just got attacked. He doesn't describe like his feeling of being repressed or anything like that. It's just like boom, he's like full capacity, just going for it. He's going to do this thing, and you're kind of like, oh man, maybe he's got something. There's kind of a thing that's going on in the story anyways, where stuff like that happens, where they'll start doing something, and the characters will do something, and they won't tell you why they're doing it. You don't really necessarily know until it's done, and so you think maybe this is another example of that. No, it's not just he's got a slug on him. This guy's like, you're seeing it from the driver's seat when he's doing these things and sort of infecting more people and spreading these slugs around and everything, and they sort of take over this restaurant. It takes a minute for you as the reader to realize that something has happened, because there's no signal that something happened. Later, Sam is rescued. You take that slug off him. And then he's confronted with the idea that the slug might reattach itself to him. And now Sam is like kind of like a man of action type character. Kind of like a James Bondish type character, sort of. Maybe not that like ridiculously competent, but similar, right? He's just terrified of this. He gets really upset and mad because he's just totally scared as hell. Maybe even like PTSD a little bit about the whole scenario. You know, that you get that perspective when he's Hagrid of like going through the motions and sort of like watching yourself do things, maybe horrible things, and not being able to do anything about it. Just and not even like being able to think about it clearly, not even be able to like worry about it or consider it. Just like those thoughts never are allowed to form. Some deep down part of you is like screaming and is terrified and hates it and is just wants to get away, wants to be free, and it just, there's no waking up, like this sort of like dream state that you just can't get out of, caged and muzzled inside yourself. Sam, not only does he infect other people with slugs and coordinate events, he uses his full capacity as an agent and all the training that he has and all the competency that he has to his fullest extent. The slugs retain the knowledge, so to speak, of someone they've attached to. There's some talk about whether or not the slugs were actually intelligent or whether they learned intelligence from attaching themselves to sentient creatures. It's an interesting concept. Slugs don't communicate. They conference or what do they call it? Conference or converge, or I can't remember the exact word that they use. But they essentially, though, like two hag-ridden or slug-infected people will sit back to back, and the slugs will touch. And when they touch, they sort of like transfer their knowledge. And so there's a sense that like the slugs are all really just one intelligence that just keeps like updating itself with like its satellite. You know, if a slug goes over here and does something and then it confers with it, then like all the slugs that those slugs confer with, that they all get that knowledge. Maybe they don't have a personality. Maybe they're all just one personality. So another really interesting. He just kind of like there's a sense in this book of like just like ideas being like tossed out. Like, oh my God, there's like, and this one too. Puppet Masters deals not just with the invasion side, where the slugs come in a flying saucer, which incidentally, they come on the backs of another species of alien who has flying saucers. The flying saucers are not slug saucers. They're flying saucers from other aliens the slugs have infected. Those body types, those aliens that they take over, are not compatible with humans, so slugs that rode on those aliens don't work on humans. Even though the slug's on someone's back, you can't just pull it off. That if you try to touch it, it would be bad. I think a couple times one of the tactics that Sam uses, he just grabs somebody's slug and just crushes it with his hands. You know, they just sort of like have this massive spasm. I guess you could say like a heart attack or like a stroke or something, essentially, and it just kills them. I think they can burn a slug or do some stuff like that to get it off of a person, but they can't, you can't just pull it off. Sam, finally, he gets his slug removed, is in the hospital for weeks and weeks for like malnutrition and like, I think he has like lice and a bunch of other stuff. Just like they don't care at all about the host. They just use them up, and they do just enough like dressing up of someone to make them look presentable when they walk out in the streets. But that's about it. Like they don't bathe usually, which is why I think they have problems with like certain plagues showing up. They don't necessarily eat. I think Sam says he might go a day or two without food. Sam, they took better care of than most. Eventually, there's a point where the characters kind of have to accept the fact that no matter what they do, even though they have some really great plans to defeat the slugs, they're always going to have to live with these new sort of rules that they have to sort of fight the slugs. One of the big ones is essentially like nudity. Like essentially you can't really wear much in the way of clothes, because anywhere a slug can touch you is it can control you. So I think there's even a part where a woman has like a handbag at her hip, and there's like a slug inside the bag attached to her with like one of like a pseudopod or something like that. And you know, that's all it took. And she was naked otherwise, because it kind of becomes normal. Like if you're essentially, there's like militias at some point, and they see you walking around with a coat, they'll just shoot first and ask questions later. There's no reliable way to say that we've gotten all the slugs, and it doesn't take very much for them to take back over again. It's like this, it literally is like this infection that just is never going to go away, this new disease that is just completely changed the way that humanity and civilization works. Heinlein really explores the back end of those ideas, that occupation side, and like what it's going to mean for humanity to sort of cope with slug occupation, even if they've been repressed to the point where there's maybe none left or there's only a few left. It's like they can never let their guard down. They can never ever let their guard down, because you never know for sure. There's like a little final scene where they're going after the slugs, the only like space type stuff we get, and it's very brief. I don't know. I guess you could almost say it sets up like the possibility of a sequel, but I know he never wrote one, and I don't think he ever intended to write one. I read this book, was so surprised that this came before Body Snatchers, but I had never heard of it. That the book was able to achieve these like really unnerving concepts and ideas and themes without really ever using language that you normally associate with that stuff. I thought it was really impressive. This is, in my opinion, a better written book, a more interesting book, just a great book in general compared to Body Snatchers. Body Snatchers has its place, and I think that it's worth your time to read. I just don't think that it really holds a candle to this book, and which is why it's so strange that we know Body Snatchers so well, but we don't know Heinlein's Puppet Masters. I think it's it. I hope I covered everything. I had a lot of notes for this, and it's a long video. I know I almost made it longer because there's a couple other stories that I wanted to talk about, and they would almost have worked. I've wanted to talk about this book since I've read it, and I didn't even have like a YouTube channel or anything at that time. I was just kind of like had this energy about this book, and I didn't know what to do with it. So it's really kind of nice to finally get this out of me, to release it. I think that you will really like this book if you like science fiction. I think maybe some people don't love Heinlein, and I understand where you're coming from if you don't. Not trying to say that this is like the greatest book ever, or it's the most amazing Heinlein book ever, but it's certainly one of those like lesser known books that I really love. These like lesser known books by more popular writers that are just kind of unknown. Kind of books I like to talk about is sort of like these big writers under the radar books they have. And I'm not really sure why this book's under the radar in the first place. I guess it doesn't quite hit this sort of, life philosophy type stuff of like Stranger in a Strange Land or like Starship Troopers. It maybe doesn't quite get to that level, and maybe that's why it's not known. But I'll tell you, if anybody else had written this book, this would be like, oh man, the guy who wrote Puppet Masters. So I guess because he wrote so much other stuff that's so well received that this book kind of gets forgotten a little bit, or at least it seems like it. Read Body Snatchers too. I think you should read them together. I think it is a good pairing, and I think that it's fun to read books around the same concept together to kind of compare ideas and kind of look at them. It's something I started doing a while back. I really find that rewarding because you kind of get to see the way different writers explore a similar idea. It makes for good reading and maybe possibly good discussion. So if you got anything to talk about this, I'd love to hear what you have to say. We can maybe finally get some comments going on some of my videos. Thank you very much for watching. What was that? Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate your time. My name is Virgil, and this was Literally Books. I'll just say it anyways. And what in the is... Thank you. Bye.